Had a few.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Real Estate Guys. And today we're going to be talking about a an interesting topic. I don't know that it's a happy or a sad one. It's just is what it is, I think, in the real world. What do they say? None of us are getting out of this life alive. And everything that two things that are guaranteed are death and taxes. So today we're going to talk about the emotions surrounding real estate and dealing with the passing of a loved one. And so I think I'll jump in and start off today just because I'm actually dealing with this personally right now, working with a gentleman that came to me actually as a real estate client initially, and we became friends over time. I helped him with quite a number of different transactions as an investor client. And recently we were doing another transaction together. And about 6 weeks after we got that transaction done, I got a phone call. And unfortunately, he called to notify me that he had been diagnosed with bone cancer and wasn't sure how long he was going to have to live. And so, not a call that anybody's interested in receiving, obviously. I was very sad and disappointed to hear that news. And as a result of that, a bunch of steps had to ensue to start working through the process of making sure that he was prepared for a real estate transaction, having owned two properties at the time. And so we sat down and talked about what he needed to have done. And in our state, and this will be an interesting question for the two of you because we haven't talked about this. In the state of Montana, we actually have a document called a transfer on death deed, which allows a property owner to designate an individual to receive their property immediately upon receipt of a death certificate to the county, which is apparently something that's available in a lot of states. I only learned about it since I've been in Montana. My background in estate and tax planning for 15 years. One of the things that we told people is they needed a trust to avoid these things, but here we have the ability to work around that with some particular documents. Do you guys have that same ability in either Florida or Kansas or Missouri?
I don't think we have that here, but I appreciate you bringing it up because now I'm going to research it. I've never heard of it though.
Okay,
Yeah,
interesting.
kind of likewise. I'm not quite sure. Uh, I have dealt with a couple situations which I'll explicate on with respect to probate upon
Mhm.
the passing of a loved one. So I'm not sure it's that simple here in Florida, but you know what? Something to look into.
Yeah, because my background was helping people set up trusts and long-term instruments for protecting their wealth and transferring their wealth to their loved ones. And I'm from Washington State originally, and I had never heard of a transfer on death until I got to Montana. We were actually able to sit down, fill out some forms for him in advance. I mean, he's still with us right now. Actually, unfortunately he's closing in on the day, probably here in the next few days. But uh, we ended up having about 4 months to kind of work through some things. And so he was able to take advantage of that. So it can be a very emotional time dealing with this stuff. I will tell you two things, and then I'll shut up and let everybody else talk. But especially from my estate planning background, what I found was number one, take the time to sit down and have a plan prior to getting to this situation. It's very, very difficult to work through these kinds of scenarios, either when you're close to dealing with a death, or especially if you're dealing with this post death, like Alan was just talking about. If you don't have a trust, if you haven't got, like in our case, the transfer on death scenario, and you go into probate, it can become a very time consuming challenge. Somebody's got to be established as the executor, executrix, and if it's not well defined in advance, now you have the potential for a lot of arguments and a lot of emotion that arises from valuation on property. And oh, I wanted it to be something that I received when dad or mom passed. Those kinds of issues come up. and they are much, much, much more difficult to deal with post-death than they are if you've defined them in advance with either an estate planning attorney or sat down even with Rocket Lawyer or LegalZoom or one of those types of programs. So that would be my initial things. I just say that we're dealing actually right now with, I think, 3 different transactions that are involving transactions with properties post the death of the owner. And some of them are going quite smoothly because they were really well planned in advance, and others not quite as well. So,
Well, I'll
Yeah, I would
speak
say,
to, go ahead, Trip.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that um, I'm actually dealing with one now, and I had forgotten because it's been quite a while. Um, but when we first signed the listing agreement to sell the property, it was the mother and the son, adult son, and unfortunately she passed. We weren't live on the market yet. It was not to go to probate. It automatically went, in this case, to the son. So from a preparation standpoint, what we chose to do was cancel the previous listing agreement and then sign a new listing agreement with just the son, which made, documentation easier to follow, for that process. Now, I think you hit Sean on something kind of really important, and I'll make this point and then move over to Alan. Is the preparation for people that have kind of an idea that they may be experiencing some life changes currently, with health issues, etc. The more they can do to plan. I have a few clients right now that have experienced either health issues or they're getting um, later on in their lifespan. And there are 2 cases right now that are proactively liquidating assets, but methodically. So one is, could be around for a long, long time. He doesn't seem to have health issues, but he's doing one property at a time, and he happens to own investment properties. And so they're being very smart about it. They're not forcing any issues. They're not hurrying, but they're being proactive about it. And I'll pass it over to Alan because maybe Alan, you have a story about somebody that maybe didn't plan. I'm not sure, but maybe you do.
Okay, well, I'd like to address 2 things. One is probate, and the other is not so much planning, or maybe planning, but what do you do after the fact? So after the fact, as an example, I had sold a commercial property and there were 3 different people involved. There was a husband and wife. The husband was not an actual blood relative, but was an attorney. Then there was a cousin, and I believe there was one other person. And the biggest issue that we face when dealing with estate sales, besides possibly probate, is agreeing on the price of the property. So how do you agree on the price of a property after the fact? Can you plan for it in advance? That's something worth looking at, because if you know somebody is in the final stages of life and you know you're going to inherit a property, if you could start to contact a realtor, an attorney, whoever you need to contact to get a fair market value for the property in advance and agree on it, that's really the key. Agree on it. It's going to save a lot of emotion after the fact. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing, and I even experienced this personally a couple of years ago, my dad had gotten cancer and he was 90 years old, and he got a blood cancer. And this was a very fit person. I mean, really, really fit, teaching 10 to 12 fitness classes a week, up until this point in time. And he just started to have trouble as he wasn't having proper blood flow and wasn't getting blood cells. I'm not going to go into all the details, but he was having trouble walking up and down the steps of his townhome. So we decided, my wife and I, that we'd buy an investment property and a property for him to live in. And he signed on with us as co-owners. Well, unfortunately, we didn't realize it, and we weren't even questioned by the title company. How do you want to have title? So we had title as tenants in common, as
Oh.
opposed to what's called right of survivorship. And guess what? We had to go through probate when he passed. We're the ones who spent all the money, and we still had to go through probate. Now, thankfully, in terms of that probate, he didn't have a lot of assets, so we had what's called a summary probate, which is a much shorter probate. And I dealt with that with somebody else recently as well, who I represented. So there are two types of probates. So basically, when you're dealing with someone who's getting toward the end of life, if it's something that you can plan for, as Sean was saying, and Trip, really try to plan for how you're going to approach the sale of the property, because there could be a lot more involved than you realize, and you don't want to get caught to where you're having to deal with it after the fact. Because I do have one client who's going through divorce, and it's taking about a year. So just, I would say, careful planning. That's really important. It may be a difficult thing. It's kind of like buying burial insurance well in advance. Nobody wants to talk about it, but it's a great thing to have, so that when someone passes, the family doesn't have to deal with it. They've got enough to deal with bereaving that person.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, a difficult one, obviously, at any stage. I know, again, being in the estate and tax planning field for years, there was always one spouse that was wanting to talk about it and one spouse that didn't want to have any conversation or think about it. But something that Trip mentioned might be an interesting thought to talk about as well. I mean, obviously, you have a lot of emotion and a lot of it's just difficult after the fact dealing with these processes, especially if I know my family, for example, I've got two sisters, and we, at least as far as I'm aware, it's been a long time since I've looked at mom and dad's estate plan that I helped them develop, almost 20 years ago. But we all are equal beneficiaries of the estate. But if one of us wanted to keep the house for a rental, or keep a rental property out of the portfolio for a rental, exactly what Alan was talking about, it becomes, oftentimes, in my experience, people decide what they think things are worth, whether that's true or not, and it can really open a can of worms, both financially and obviously emotionally. People get their nose bent out of shape pretty quickly when money gets involved. And so, again, there's no way to really evaluate the value of a property prior to death. If you're doing it at any length in advance anyway, always doing what these guys have talked about and making sure you get the proper individuals involved in valuation and those kinds of things. But something Trip mentioned happened to me this last year, where we had a buyer purchasing a property at the last stages of life. He was terminally ill with cancer. We weren't even sure. We were a little nervous of whether he was even going to make it to the closing date. He did, in fact, made it to the closing date in about a month or so beyond. And 1031 exchange thought process was quite interesting. So he had sold a ranch, and he needed to roll those proceeds from that ranch into another piece of real estate in order to avoid the tax implications of that sale. And my sellers were they actually made a comment that they felt really bad that they were going to the closing table to sell this property to a guy that might not even be around 30 days later. And I had to sit down with him and say, here's the reality. He is doing planning in this stage to protect his beneficiaries. If he were to pass away having not closed this transaction, all of a sudden those funds sitting there in cash would be a taxable event to the beneficiaries. And so by rolling it into another piece of real estate, those beneficiaries are going to be able to receive the value of that property with with a full step up in basis value, and no taxable event. And so oftentimes the pre-planning is not just to avoid the emotion and the potential arguments that can ensue as part of an estate being distributed on the backside, but it can be a huge benefit to the beneficiaries from a tax perspective, where if you, like in the case of Tripp's clients, if you hold that real estate until your death and then it's passed to your beneficiaries, they get the benefit of a full step up in basis value from a taxable event, and they're able to avoid, they can turn around and immediately put that property on the market and sell it without a taxable event. So there are huge benefits to thinking through these situations in advance, looking at your individual situation and trying to figure out what's going to be in your best interest while you're living, and or what may be in the best interest of your family, or whoever you've decided to leave those assets to. So this is kind of a passion for me. I love, probably the most fun I've ever had, as difficult as the conversations were, was doing estate planning, because it's so creative and there's so many ways that you can do wonderful things that make life easier for your loved ones, easier for your kids, easier for your spouse. If something unexpected happens, or if, something's coming up and like my friend, you're counting the days scenario. So anyhow, anything else from either of the two of you that you want to throw in as a last minute thought?
I guess the only other thing is that in this transaction I had recently, where this man had inherited a home from his father here in Florida. His father didn't have a lot of assets, but he did have some credit card debt. He did have a little bit of debt, and you have to look at whether that debt is part of the sale of the home or not. And that also plays into the type of probate that it is, whether it's a summary, a quicker probate, or a long probate, which could take months. And thankfully for him, it was outside of the sale. It was done in that way. So that was huge for him. So that's just one of those things that has to be looked at.
Yeah, it's a great point. I could talk on this particular topic for hours because of the things I've personally witnessed and experienced with people over the years. But you're absolutely correct. I've seen probates that have taken years, not months, 3 and 4 years, because the siblings get into an argument, can't come to a resolution because things weren't well defined. I've seen, even unfortunately, even in a trust environment, I had a personal one where the 3 siblings met at a table with me a week before Dad passed. We thought we had some time. I told my partner at the time, I was like, wow, this is going to be really easy. Everybody gets along great. And Friday night, Dad passed away. I had met with him on Monday. Before I was out of bed on Saturday morning, I had received a phone call from the youngest sibling wanting to know when she was going to get her money. And that started a 3-year battle, where we offered to give her $90,000 in cash from the estate immediately. They were going to have to borrow the money to get it. She argued about the value of the property. It was sold finally 3 years later for, if I remember correctly, $40,000 less than what we had valued it at 3 years prior and we're willing to write her a third of. I mean, that's just the kind of stuff that can happen if you're not planned. And so, and unfortunately, in that particular case, last I had talked to them, the other two sisters had not talked to that sibling since. And so,
And that
emotions
can
run
happen.
high.
That
Yeah.
can absolutely happen. So everybody, we've talked about very sensitive topics. Take it to heart, do some good, careful planning. And we promise that our next show will be a little more joyful. And we'll see you next time.